For our next installment on ancient governments, we're going to take a look at the Roman Republic. A quick little note first, though, about the geography of Rome in Italy. The ancient city of Rome, you will see, sat in a region surrounded by different tribes and races of people. The most significant of these included the Latins, the Etruscans, and the Sabines. Got it? Okay, let's go! Recall where we left off in class after our reading of Virgil's epic The Aeneid. After Aeneas won the war, he married King Latinus's daughter, Lavinia, and founded the city of Lavinium. His son Ascanius, or Iulus, depending on how you look at it, would eventually set off on his own to found the town of Alba Longa. Two of Ascanius's eventual descendants would be Romulus and Remus. These twin brothers would be condemned, though, through no fault of their own, to death shortly after their birth, and abandoned on the banks of the Tiber River. Legend says that they were found and suckled by a she-wolf until a herdsman found them and took them in. According to the Roman historian Livy, when Romulus and Remus grew up, they decided to found a new settlement on the spot where they had been left to drown as infants. Unfortunately, the founding of this settlement was marred by a dispute. There are a couple of different versions of the story, and you can read Livy to find out more, but in short, the brothers were unable to determine which one of them would govern the town and give his name to it. They fought, and Romulus killed his brother Remus. Romulus thus became the city's first king and gave his name to the new settlement, Rome. Our legend continues following the founding of Rome. 6 kings would rule the city after Romulus, bringing the total, including Romulus, to 7 legendary kings. They would come from different tribes that inhabited the regions surrounding Rome: Latins, Etruscans, and Sabines. If you take a look at the length of the reign for each king, you may notice that it seems inordinately long. Statistically, it may be normal for a few kings to rule over a long period of time, but it would also be expected that there would be a few kings who ruled over shorter intervals of time. This is one of the reasons why these kings seem to have been melded historically into legend. But enough about ancient history. We are concerned with the Roman Republic and its system of government. To understand how that came about, we need to look at the last king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus. Note the pronunciation of Superbus, not Superbus. He was an Etruscan. Remember that. Tarquinius was not a very well-liked king, but our story actually concerns his son, Sextus. You see, Sextus had attended a party along with some Roman aristocrats and princes. As the evening wore on, the topic of conversation turned to their wives, and which one of them was the best and most virtuous woman. Among these revelers was a man named Collatinus, who was a Latin, not an Etruscan. Collatinus proposed that they go and see what their wives were up to in order to determine which one of them was the best and most virtuous wife. Upon arriving at Collatinus's house, the men found his wife Lucretia hard at work spinning and weaving. Collatinus's wife had won the contest in womanly virtue. She invited the men in, and it was at this point that Sextus Tarquinius began lusting after Lucretia. Later in the week, when Lucretia's husband, Collatinus, was away on business, Sextus invited himself back to Lucretia's home and, in the evening, stole into her room and took advantage of her. When Collatinus returned, Lucretia told him and his companions the entire story, and then, sadly, sacrificed herself. It was at this point in the tragic story that one of Collatinus's friends, Brutus, no, not the Brutus who would assassinate Julius Caesar, but interestingly enough, one of his ancestors. Anyway, this Brutus picked up the bloody dagger and swore to depose Tarquinius Superbus and his entire family. This was the beginning of the end of kingship in Rome. Collatinus and Brutus led a mob of angry Romans who stormed Tarquinius's palace and drove out the Etruscan king and his followers. The Latins were now in charge. According to Livy, after this liberation, the consuls, 2 consuls, were elected by popular vote of the centuries, and Rome's first 2 consuls were Lucius Brutus and Lucius Collatinus. You're probably wondering what all this has to do with the political system in Rome. Well, after the last king was deposed, by the way, Rome would never again have another king, and it was obsessed with making sure of that. Anyway, after the last king was deposed, the Romans set about establishing a republican system of government. You can now refer to your handout and fill it out as you continue watching. Ready? Here we go. First, you guessed it, some important terms to help you better understand. Roman society and its politics were quite patriarchal in nature. This meant that men were the ones who held power, and that the leading men of the state were seen as fathers in charge of the household of Rome. Roman citizens were at first divided into two different classes. Patricians, who came from the original ruling class families during the days of kings, formed the first class. They were much like aristocrats and usually held political offices, and they were seen as fathers of the state. Plebeians formed the second class. They were those who were not of the original ruling class families. At first, they could not hold political office, but that would later change. Later on, a new middle class of knights, or equites, would also develop. This mainly consisted of wealthy plebeians who had enough money to afford a horse if going into battle. Our next term is Imperium. This is the Latin word for the power to rule, and those who held it had the executive power of the Roman state, both in military and in judicial matters. Our next two terms are connected with the political structure. A tribus was a tribe. The first Roman tribes were probably based on one's ethnicity. Were you Latin, Etruscan, Sabine, etc.? But that would later become more numerous and involve people who were not necessarily of the same group. This brings us to the curia, or city ward. According to legend, Romulus divided the population into 3 different tribes, each containing 10 curiae, for a total of 30 curiae. And now, on to the fun stuff. Let's take a look at the structure of the Roman republican system of government. At its heart lies the Senate, or Senatus, as it was called. From the Latin word senex, meaning old man, senators who sat on the Senate were seen as fathers of the state, or patres. Old men leading the state. Does this remind you of anything? And once again, like in ancient Greece, male citizens were the only ones who had the ability to hold political office or vote. But back to the Senate. In early times, senators were appointed by the king from among his friends and cities' leading families. They would usually be of patrician status. Later on, however, senators could come from either patrician or plebeian classes. Though their numbers fluctuated throughout history, there were generally between 300 and 600 of them, and their main job was to propose legislation for the Senate and people to vote on. Besides the Senate, there were 4 other comitia, or assemblies, that could vote. The first was the Comitia Curiata. This assembly is not on our org chart, but it was an assembly of adult, arms-bearing men organized according to their curia. Their main job was to ratify the election of magistrates who held Imperium. This assembly would later become politically obsolete. The next important comitia was the Comitia Centuriata. This was an assembly of adult, arms-bearing men. Notice the trend here with arms-bearing? Think back to Athens and Sparta. Anyway, this assembly was organized according to centuries. What's a century, you ask? It was a fighting unit in the Roman army. Like the English words century, cent, and the French word cent, a Roman century originally consisted of 100 men. As the org chart suggests, the Comitia Centuriata was tasked with electing the praetors, consuls, both of whom held Imperium, and the 2 censors. When Romans voted in the Comitia Centuriata, they had originally voted in centuries of 100 men. But as warfare changed, there came the development of cavalry, an elite corps in the Roman legion that was composed mainly of the rich. Centuries later came to be grouped according to census classes. They were, in other words, now based on wealth, and not necessarily the military. Whereas centuries used to consist of 100 men, with each man having one ballot, they were now organized according to wealth. And so, a wealthier century could have fewer than 100 men, where your ballot would count for more, or, for the less wealthy, centuries consisted of hundreds of men, where because of the greater numbers, your ballot counted for less. So, how might this be unfair? Well, consider that there were 193 centuries in Rome, and the wealthier centuries voted first. Now, throw in some basic math skills, and you'll see that you would need just 97 centuries, just over half of them, for a vote to carry the day. Each century as a whole gets one official vote, for a total of 193 votes in an election. So, if there were 7 people in your century, and 4 had given a ballot of yes, and 3 had given a ballot of no, then your century's official one vote would be a yes. Since there were fewer men in the wealthy centuries, one person's ballot carried a lot more weight than in a poorer century where your ballot was only one of hundreds. Fun fact, this voting system served as inspiration for the system of government when the Republic of the United States of America was founded. But back to the Comitia Centuriata. At the end of the day, you would need 97 centuries votes for a vote to carry the day. And since the wealthier centuries voted first, it was quite possible that if 97 centuries ahead of yours voted one way, no matter how you or your century voted, things would have already been decided before you even got to cast your ballot. Once again, this hierarchical structure favored the rich. But don't worry, there was another assembly in which your voice could be heard. The Comitia Plebes Tributa, or as it was more commonly known, the Concilium Plebis, was an assembly that was created especially for the plebeians, who felt that their voices were not being heard in the Roman Republic. Recall that patricians were most often the ones who held political offices. Because of this imbalance in power, and because plebeians had no right to appeal decisions made by the patrician government, the plebeians eventually rose up in protest. Actually, they threatened the patricians with a complete withdrawal from Rome, including military service. They therefore created their own assembly, the Concilium Plebis. This assembly was strictly only for plebs, and it was tasked with electing the plebeian tribunes and plebeian aediles. The Concilium Plebis also had the right to enact plebiscites, or resolutions by the common people that had the weight of law. Finally, we have the Comitia Populi Tributa. This assembly consisted of both patricians and plebeians, and it was responsible for electing quaestors and curule aediles. The last part of our video will be devoted to explaining what all these various political offices that the Comitiae voted on actually were. Each of these magistracies had a 1-year term of office, after which elections would once again be held, and the Comitiae would vote again. If we take a look back at our org chart, you will notice that each of the 3 assemblies had the responsibilities for electing certain magistrates. Each of these magistrates, with the exception of military tribunes, were eligible to sit in the Senatus. So, if you were a young Roman man, how would you begin your political career? Well, for starters, it's important to understand that the Romans were often sticklers for hierarchy, and so there was a sort of political ladder of magistracies, known as the cursus honorum, through which you had to pass in order to accede to the highest political office of consul. The cursus honorum began with the position of quaestor, then aedile, followed by praetor, and finally consul. In short, if you ever wanted to become a consul, you had to, with very few exceptions, have passed through the cursus honorum. Not surprisingly, it was usual for a young man to begin their political career in the military. If you were of the equites, or of the patrician classes, you would usually serve time in the army amongst the Roman legions as a military tribune. That's why there were 24 of them. In the later Republic, military tribunes would serve in different capacities in the legion under the legates in charge, usually in an administrative role. A similar type of office was also available only to plebeians, and this was the plebeian tribune. This magistracy, too, would usually serve as a stepping stone toward a young plebeian's political career. Unlike the position of military tribune, this office was open only to plebeians and was elected by the concilium plebis. This magistracy is one of the most interesting ones, as the plebeian tribune was tasked with looking after plebeian interests. They could summon meetings of the concilium plebis, elicit plebiscites, and most importantly, held veto power in the senatus. This meant that a plebeian tribune had the right to block any legislation that he thought was against the interest of the plebs. As you can well imagine, this enormous power to propose and veto legislation gave the plebeian tribunes much power. Luckily, their bodies were considered sacrosanct. This meant that no one could harm or violate their bodies without risking capital punishment. During the late Republic, you can well imagine how savvy patricians and ambitious politicians could manipulate the system by co-opting the veto of a plebeian tribune. Now, on to the first official rung of the cursus honorum, that of quaestor. As the most junior magistracy of the Roman political ladder, quaestors were in charge of the finances of the state treasury. They also served in various capacities in the Roman provinces, such as raising taxes, securing recruits for the legions, or even performing military functions. If you served your time as quaestor, the next level for advancement on the cursus honorum was aedile. There were a total of 4 aediles, 2 of whom had to be plebeian. The plebeian aediles supervised the temples and cults of the plebs, and also acted as the executives of the plebeian tribunes. The curule aediles, at first only patricians, but later either patrician or plebeian, were primarily in charge of the urban plebs. This meant that they looked after the care of the city, cura urbis, such as its streets, temples, water supply, and market, and they even acted as prosecutors. They would also later look after the distribution of the corn dole, cura annoni. This was a system whereby certain Roman citizens were entitled to receive corn provided freely by the state. Finally, one of the aediles' most important duties was to look after the administration of public games, cura ludorum solemnium. That included chariot races, gladiatorial games, and other such entertainment. As political rivalries became more pronounced in the later Republic, the office of aedile was a perfect opportunity for ambitious politicians to spend large amounts of money on their own to put on lavish games in the hopes of gaining political favor with the voting masses. Bread and circuses, anyone? Now, if you didn't bankrupt yourself during your aedileship, then you would hope to run for the office of praetor, the next step on the cursus honorum. Unlike the other magistracies before it, the praetorship carried with it Imperium. Remember that word? This meant that a praetor had the executive power of the Roman state, both in military and in judicial matters. Most commonly, the praetor's duties involved administering the laws of the state by performing civil jurisdiction, presiding over criminal courts, and occasionally presiding over the senatus. As a magistrate with Imperium, this also meant that the praetor could perform almost all the same duties as the consul, including lead the state and/or the army. And, with the expansion of the Roman territories, there were more and more provinces that required governing. And so, often after a 1-year praetorship, a politician would have his praetorship extended, becoming a pro-praetor, and he would go on to administer one of Rome's increasing number of provinces, before coming back to Rome. Finally, we arrive at the top of the cursus honorum with the office of consul. You'll remember that after the last king of Rome was deposed, Brutus and Collatinus were elected the first two consuls of Rome. Not surprisingly, the consuls held Imperium and were the two heads of the Roman Republic. They looked after both the civil and military administration of the state, having the right to summon meetings of the senatus and the assemblies, and commanding the army. Remember how the Romans swore never again to have a king? Well, the fact that there were two consuls to keep each other in check, and the fact that these magistracies lasted for only 1 year, certainly helped ensure this. One interesting perk that came with the consulship was each consul's right to be attended by 12 lictors. Praetors got to have 6. These were attendants who accompanied the magistrates everywhere, announcing their approach and clearing a path for them, and even helping implement their rights to arrest and summon people. The lictors carried with them fasces, basically a bundle of rods surrounding an axe. During Etruscan times, the fasces had been a symbol of power and the right to exercise it, and the Romans adopted it. In fact, this is where we get the English word fascism from. 2 more magistracies to go. Still with me? Let's start with the office of censor, which came later on to be regarded as the highest position in the cursus honorum. Censors were usually 2 retired consuls, and unlike the other magistrates, they were elected once every 4 to 5 years. Their primary task was to make up and maintain the official list of Roman citizens by conducting a census, a practice our government still carries on today. The censor's power, however, extended well beyond conducting the census itself. They were also in charge of supervising the morals of the community. When the list of citizens was drawn up by the censors, if they found a man whose private or public conduct was not in conforming to the morals of the republic, they could remove him from his tribe and bar him from voting. The censors also revised the membership of the senatus, removing any senators whom they deemed did not qualify to sit in the Senate. Finally, they also looked after the leasing of revenue-producing properties, such as lands, forests, mines, etc., and the contracts for the collection of taxes. Our whirlwind tour of the Roman Republican system of government ends with the unique position of dictator. As you can see from the org chart, the dictator was also someone who held Imperium. Unlike a tyrant who seized power unconstitutionally, a dictator was normally appointed by a magistrate with Imperium after authorization by the senatus, and only in times of extreme crises. A dictator was called upon usually to command an army or to perform a specific task, such as holding elections or dealing with sedition. This emergency magistracy was found quite frequently, especially in the early Republic, since Rome was often at war against neighboring tribes and territories. The unique thing about Roman dictatorship was that a dictator could only hold this office for a maximum of 6 months, after which he was expected to resign. But during this term in office, his imperium trumped that of all other magistrates, and he was in effect the top dog in charge of the state. Once again, the Romans were able to avoid the return of kingship by ensuring that dictators had to be voted in, and they were expected to resign their power after a fixed period of time. Now, of course, later on, near the end of the Republic, some politicians would take advantage of this and corrupt the system, but more on that later. For now, this concludes our look at the Roman Republic. Thanks for watching.